There's this Paul Graham essay that almost every founder is familiar with, but almost none of them actually follow through with it. And that is, do things that don't scale. When you hear that, it's like, hey, does this even actually work? Like, is there actual evidence that this would work? You can even feel like an amateur doing that. People resort to building systems instead of doing the things that don't scale, and they wonder like, okay, why isn't anything working? What am I doing wrong? So the common belief is like, I need to build something scalable from day one. Manual processes aren't sustainable. I shouldn't be doing this. A system should be doing this, or an AI automation or an AI agent should be doing this. When you say things like this, you actually sound smart, but there's a whole different side of things that people actually don't realize when they say these things themselves and actually not doing the tiny things that matter. So in this video, we're gonna dive deep into figuring out like, okay, what is the true meaning of this essay and how can you actually do things that don't scale and eventually scale your business. So don't get me wrong, founders don't skip these processes because they are lazy. They actually skip it because it's hard, or like it's very manual and it's unsexy, and like almost no one would feel like doing it. Even I wouldn't feel like doing it. But the thing is, when you're actually building a system or building an AI agent or automating a workflow, it feels like progress because you can see that happening in real time. You can see that maybe getting your results or maybe executing your tasks. So if you're sending out 50 emails or 50 DMs, that could feel like failure. But if you're like automating and sending like 100 or 200 emails a day, that actually feels like progress, right? But when you're manually writing your first 50 emails, your first 50 messages, your DMs, that actually teaches you something much more in-depth, and that thinking process of doing all those things hands-on has so much more value down the line than you may or may not realize in the moment. I'll take an example. If you look at the co-founders of Airbnb, the very first listings, they could have asked the owners to just upload this and list it, but they actually went to the apartments or Airbnbs themselves, met the owners, took their own camera gear, took all those things needed at that time, and they did the photography and they helped list them up. When they actually did this, like instead of automating building lists, they understood what it's like to be their own customer or their own consumer. So some of the decisions they made down the line actually originated from that experience of doing the work themselves. If they didn't go ahead and do this themselves, they would not have realized if you have good images, good photos of the listing, the conversion rate is much higher. That's something they might not have figured out on their own if they didn't go and did that granular work. That's just a very tiny example of how the Airbnb co-founders did unscalable thing that actually resulted in a lot of their customers benefiting in the long term because of their findings. Another thing is the Stripe founders, Patrick and John. They initially personally onboarded all their clients. They literally sat next to their client, took out their laptops, and then just onboarded and integrated their payment system to the clients. So why did they do that? They could have just asked the client to do it themselves, because when they actually did that, when they met with their clients in person, they obviously built a really good relationship with their early users. That's one thing. But the other thing is they got to understand all the questions and the struggles and whatever they had to go through for them to use their product. They got a sneak peek into how their infrastructure tech side of things are set up. If they didn't actually sit down with those initial clients, they wouldn't have actually got that understanding that they did, which they later on took that knowledge to actually make the onboarding process much better. That's another example of how those founders at an early stage did unscalable things to achieve a large amount of scale in the future. So another quick example, something that I got to experience personally, we had a client. They actually wanted to do large-scale outreach from day one, which is not something that we would recommend. So what ended up happening was we did the first 10 to 20 messages manually, where we looked at the initial founder and then got an idea about who they are, what they do, and then tried to draft messages based on common ground. That was like the unscalable thing that we did, and we got like 20 to 30% reply rates from that. Because of that initial success, the client wanted to go all in on automation and blast out the same message to everyone, because they think that's the solution, because numbers are what made sense to them. So they just uploaded a huge list and then started an outreach campaign of sending out like 500 DMs over the course of a few weeks. That actually brought down the reply rates to like 10%. The takeaway from that tiny experience is that you have to spend more time kind of understanding what your prospects are expecting, and then what they are essentially looking for, and how they wanted to be approached. So 20 is not that big of a sample size. I would recommend, like, if you're trying to do email or DM outreach or anything, right, at least have a sample size of 100 where you test out different messages, different approaches, and then kind of get a feel for it, figure out what actually works for that particular product, service, or scenario, and then you can focus on scaling. So you just have to kind of focus on the unscalable part at first. That's like an example of doing outreach. So let's take a normal framework. So now I'm going to give you like a very simple framework that you can actually follow to figure out what your unscalable way of doing it is, and then how you can eventually turn it to a scalable way of doing it. So let's say there's like a process that you want to automate, or like add a lot of features so that it doesn't take as much time, or just you want to hand it over to another employee, or like hire someone to do it on your behalf. And that's actually true. That's the right mindset to have, because you have to eventually delegate your tasks and free up your time so that you can focus on what that matters. But if you're doing that from the start itself, you're doing it wrong. What you should do is, first, you should actually do the same task or the same process at least 10 times. Let's take an example. Client onboarding. You have to onboard at least 10 clients yourself. You cannot let your employees, your customer success, or anyone take over. Do it yourself. And while you're doing it, take notes of every single friction point that happened. Write down every single question those clients or prospects ask. Once you have those feedback, those 10 questions, those things you noted down from the 10 calls that you have a much better idea of like what are the frictions, or like the common questions that your clients have, the common struggles that they have. Once you have a sense of that, you can actually use that knowledge to make the onboarding process much more seamless. It's the same theory for pretty much everything, right? Do it at least 10 times. I recommend doing it 20 or 30 times to get a much more better sense of where you're headed. But it depends on the time and the resources you have at your disposal. You have to have the most understanding of everything that you're doing. That doesn't mean that you should literally learn each and every skill and like divide your time or whatever. But as a founder, you should know each and everything that's going on. You should be able to guide people. So yeah, I mean, that's literally your product roadmap right there. That's literally your retention strategy sitting right there. Because once you go through these calls and get a better understanding of what's going on, you have the knowledge to actually navigate and understand what's wrong and where it's wrong. And that's because you did that unscalable, unsexy thing of just sitting down and doing the work yourself. So that's why people like to say, like, founders who scale the fastest aren't the ones who automated early on. They are the ones who actually stayed manual the longest. So yeah, that brings us to the end of this video. So I hope you got a better sense of why it's important to do all these mundane tasks and doing the things that don't scale, because in the end, that's what actually helps you scale. Please extend your thoughts, share your feedback, and I would love to have a chat with you. So just connect with me on LinkedIn, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.